Hello everybody. The topic for today's seminar is essentially about cultural rights and land. And what I'd like to do for the next 15 minutes or so is just to provide some background information to feed the discussion and to help structure our discussion later on. So I'll say something about what cultural rights are. I'll say something about how they relate to land. I'll talk a little bit about why I'm interested in this issue and why at this moment in time. And then I'll finish by outlining some of the questions and angles that I'm beginning to explore myself in this area as part of the fellowship that I'm currently doing with Durham University in connection with the Negotiating Landscapes of Rights project. And I'd just like to underline that at this moment, this is an area that I'm really beginning to explore myself, so I'd really look forward to the discussion, and I'm sure I'll get a lot from talking to you all. And because it's a seminar rather than a lecture, I'd like us to discuss these questions together as a group. So I'm going to ask you to contribute actively to the discussion. And while I'll certainly contribute further myself, I really want to hear from you as well. So please think as I'm talking, and think about examples you can share from the places and contexts that you know. Think about other ways of looking at the topic and the issues that I'm going to raise here, other questions, other angles, other points of view, and so on. Let me start then by saying a little bit about what cultural rights are. Cultural rights have been part of the international human rights framework since the 1940s, and they've been promoted through a range of different UN instruments and declarations. In terms of what these particular rights are, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that, to quote, "Everyone is entitled to realization of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and the free development of his personality. Everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. Everyone has the right to the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author." So cultural rights relate to quite a broad range of issues. Some of these are to do with science, education, intellectual property, and so on. Other cultural rights are to do with culture in the more anthropological sense of the term. And it's these cultural rights, these more anthropological cultural rights, that I'm interested in particularly today. So here we might think more specifically of rights relating to aspects of culture like language, particular ways of life, particular practices, people's community and group institutions, particular forms of cultural expression and knowledge, shared values, beliefs, identities, and ways of seeing the world, and the heritage and resources that people draw on in their cultural life, including both intangible and tangible aspects of that heritage, and both cultural and natural heritage, all of which can play a role in cultural life in one way or another. So we might say that cultural rights are about fulfilling people's need to access and take part in and benefit from cultural life. They're also about people being able to take the lead in identifying, safeguarding, and transmitting their own cultural heritage. And it's important that these rights are promoted, both generally speaking and in specific cases. In general terms, the point is that culture is fundamental to our humanity. And this is why culture is therefore a human rights issue. As the UN have put it, for example, cultural rights protect the rights for each person, as well as for groups of people, to develop and express their humanity, their worldview, and the meanings they give to their existence and their development. So, in general terms, cultural rights matter for all of us. In specific terms, cultural rights have become important in efforts to defend and promote the rights of particular groups in society, particularly people who experience marginalisation, discrimination, injustice, and inequalities of many different kinds. So, for example, cultural rights are often an important issue when it comes to defending the rights of women, minorities, and indigenous peoples. So if that gives us a sense of what cultural rights are, today, of course, I've said the question is about how cultural rights relate to land. And I think there's two main aspects to that. The first is cultural rights to land. In other words, what rights do people have to own, occupy, use, or access land by virtue of their particular culture? So that's the first point, cultural rights to land. The second is the importance of land rights to culture, to flip things on their head. So the importance of land rights to culture, in other words, in what ways is land important, or essential even, to people's ability to realise their cultural rights, to live that cultural life to which they're entitled. So this is about why people need access to land in order to live the cultural life which is fundamental to their humanity and to their development, whether as individuals or as communities. And these two things, land rights and cultural rights, are in some senses, and of course, two sides of the same coin. So it's important to bring them together as we're doing today, because doing so leads us to think both about the rights that people might have to land, which are based in culture, and about the responsibilities that people who, in one way or another, control land might have towards others whose cultural life is affected by the extent to which and the manner in which they can access and use the land. To begin to ground the discussion a little bit, let me say a few words about why I'm interested in this issue of cultural rights and land, and why now, at this moment in time. I come at this from the perspective of my own home, which is here in Scotland. And in Scotland, we have a very concentrated pattern of land ownership, with most of the land being owned by a very small number of people. It's been estimated, for example, that 50% of rural Scotland, which is most of the land area, is owned by just over 400 private owners. And that's something like 0.08% of the population controlling 50% of the land. What this means is that we have a problem of land monopolies. In many parts of the country, an individual or a small number of people exercise monopoly control over the land, and this can lead to others being excluded from decisions about the land and excluded from accessing and using the land as well. And these are decisions which affect them, affect their families and affect their communities, of course. As the Scottish Land Commission, which is a public body, has put it, concentrated land ownership is causing significant and long-term harm to the communities affected. But the situation here is not static, of course, and we have a history of land reform activism which stretches back to the 19th century. And in the last 20 years, land reform has become an important aspect of the work of the Scottish Parliament since that Parliament was re-established in 1999. Since then, a number of new land reform laws have been passed. And while I don't want to get into the detail of all of those, I do want to pick up on one issue, which is the way that human rights issues have been handled in Scottish land reform over the course of the last 2 decades. Broadly speaking, we might say that in the 2000s, consideration of human rights issues tended to focus on the potential for land reform to be limited by the European Convention on Human Rights and what that convention has to say around people's right to enjoy their property. But in the last 10 years, this position has changed, and human rights have moved from being seen as a potential barrier to reform to being seen as a core part of the purpose of reform, or what reform is about. So land reform is now very much being approached as an opportunity to promote the progressive realisation of a wide range of human rights, including people's cultural rights. So we've gone beyond private rights to property here to more collective rights of many different kinds. And this is exemplified by a new land reform law that was passed in 2016, and which, well, generally speaking, requires the Scottish Government to promote human rights in relation to land. And more specifically, it makes the fulfilment of human rights a consideration when the government is assessing applications by communities for the compulsory transfer of land from private ownership into community ownership. And it's important to note here that the human rights in question in this new law extend beyond civil and political rights that have been characterised as being rooted in the Western liberal democratic tradition and are often seen as, therefore, as being individual rights. So it extends beyond those to include economic, social and cultural rights, which have been described as representing a socialist conceptualization of human rights rather than individualist conceptualization. So what this means, to step back from all of that, is that issues around the ownership, use and access to land are now more clearly rooted in ideas of collective rights and also of responsibilities that those who control land have towards others and towards the fulfilment of other people's human rights. But these developments raise a series of questions, including, well, what exactly do we mean about what exactly do we mean by cultural rights in this context, in the Scottish context, and in relation to land? What changes to our land ownership, land tenure, and land access arrangements might be needed in order for people to fulfil this wider range of rights? And this is really what I'm focusing on for the fellowship, as my contribution to the Negotiating Landscapes of Rights project is exploring in more depth what exactly cultural rights might mean in Scotland when it comes to land and land reform. I have to say as well, my background is in cultural heritage, not in the law. So I'm not approaching this through a legal lens as a question of how the law might operate and all of the ins and outs and the challenges of the legal side of this. Rather, what I'm interested in and what I think I can bring to this is to look at the cultural aspect of it, which is to say, in concrete terms, what are the cultural bases upon which these land rights might be claimed, and what concrete forms of cultural life, if you like, might be enabled by greater access to ownership of use of the land. So this is about who has cultural rights to land in Scotland, and what is the particular cultural basis for those rights. Why is access to land necessary in order to sustain particular forms of cultural life? And how have people's cultural rights to land been realised or frustrated through time in this particular context? So this is leading me to look at things like examples of land rights that have been established and sustained through occupation and use of the land rather than through legal title. So it's a kind of practical ownership of the land, if you like, through ownership through practice. It's leading me to look at examples of rights that have been established through collective struggle and how the histories of those struggles continue to play a role in sustaining people's claims to the land or their expectations about how they ought to be able to access and use land. Examples of land rights that are based in particular ways of life and particular land use and other practices, of which we have a number here in Scotland. Looking at examples of rights that are rooted in particular individual or collective genealogies, or the membership of a particular community. So how people trace their rights through a kind of an inheritance, whether that's a personal family inheritance or not in a non-legal sense, or through a more collective cultural community inheritance. And also in examples where people have been denied their right to cultural life by being excluded from the land. So where people feel that access to that land is essential to the cultural life, but that is something that they've been excluded from exercising, and so on. So I want to finish there so that we can move on to the discussion. As we're talking, I can certainly say more about the Scottish context, maybe talk about some of these concrete examples that I'm thinking of in talking here. But as I say, I'd like to approach this as an opportunity to share knowledge and examples, to raise and explore questions, your questions as well as mine, and to look at the topic from different angles, different cultural points of view, different places in the world, different disciplinary backgrounds, different professional backgrounds, and so on, different personal experiences. So please do join in and talk about how these issues look to you from the places that you know, whether that's elsewhere in the UK or in other countries across the world, from the point of view that you have from your own particular background, or indeed from any other point of view that you wish to. Thank you very much.